Episode 7. God bless you and welcome back to Bible FAQ with Kirk Van, the podcast that provides brief, thoughtful, biblical answers to your questions. I am Kirk Van Odeham, your host, and I'm looking forward to answering some wonderful questions that I received for this episode. And I've received many different questions from several people who have been listening to the podcast, and I just want to let everyone know who sent in questions. I am working my way through them. I can only answer a couple per episode, so I will get to all the questions that have been asked. If you want to submit your question to have addressed on the podcast, please visit the website kirkvan.com. You can submit your question there, or also you can submit your question via our Facebook page, Bible FAQ with Kirk Van. And also we have an email, question@kirkvan.com. So any of those ways, you can submit your question to have answered on the podcast. And just a quick reminder also, the podcast is available in audio-only format, which is the true podcast format. And it's available on several different apps and services, including Apple Podcasts, the default app for iPhones, Google Podcasts, the default app for Android devices. It's also on Spotify, Stitcher, and probably about 10 other apps that it's registered with. And of course, if you use a different app that's not one of the more popular ones, it can be available on those too through the RSS feed. So visit the website kirkvan.com to learn more about how to access the podcast if you don't know how to do that. And there's links to all the different services, apps, registry that we're listed with. You should have no problem getting connected if you decide to do so. All right, let's get right to the questions for tonight's episode. The first question is another one that comes to me from right here in Muncie, Indiana. The good old home church folks keeping me supplied with questions. And this one comes from Sarah from our church at River of Life. And Sarah asks this: is Leviathan in Job? I've heard many preach that he and Lucifer are one and the same. I have also heard taught that he is a separate being and that Lucifer is not our only adversary. Is there another fallen angel? Who is Leviathan? Well, there's a couple different ways to answer this. So let me just start out by saying that the term Leviathan is specifically mentioned by name in 5 different passages in the Old Testament. So, of course, it is a biblical term. And as Sarah mentioned, it is in Job. That's probably the most, it is the most descriptive of all the accounts that describe Leviathan in the Bible. And so it's mentioned by name 5 times, but it's also probably alluded to or references in a few other passages as well. So the term is actually transliterated in English translation of the Bible from a Hebrew word that is very close in pronunciation. So it's basically the same word in English and Hebrew, just probably pronounced a little differently. The Hebrew pronunciation is probably something to the effect of Leviathan, and then of course transliterated as Leviathan in the English language. So this word comes from the Hebrew root word that means to twine or unite. Also can mean to cleave or join. And so this root word combined with an adjective suffix, if you will, Leviathan literally means wreathed or twisted into folds, and we'll understand why that is in just a moment here. So let me give you a quick preview of my answer here, and then I'll get into some of the details. So references to Leviathan in Scripture seem to be used in a few different ways, and here's 3 ways that it's used in Scripture. First, as a literal animal or creature. That's the direct meaning. This is a literal animal or creature. But I believe it's also used metaphorically to refer to the enemies of Israel, and again also used metaphorically to refer to the devil or Satan himself. So we'll take each of these. So first, Scripture indeed presents Leviathan as a real, literal animal or creature. And as we mentioned, Job, chapter number 41, that chapter is almost entirely dedicated to describing this sea creature known as Leviathan. And so Job 41 appears obviously right after Job number 40. So the previous chapter in Job 40 refers to another creature, Behemoth, which is described as a powerful land animal. And then in Job 41, this Leviathan is described as a powerful sea creature or sea animal. So in the context of Job, God is responding to complaints made by Job by contrasting himself, God, to these most powerful creatures of the land and sea. And to summarize kind of the general lesson here of these chapters is that man is powerless against these natural physical animals, but God is even more powerful, fearsome, and awesome than these. And so the lesson seems to have been well received by Job, because after the description of the behemoth and the Leviathan, Job's response is to acknowledge that God's wisdom and power are limitless. And he says, Job admits that I spoke about things that I did not understand. And then later the chapter reveals that Job feels ashamed and repents from his critical complaints against God for the situation that he's going through. And so that's the context in which Job discusses these animals. Now, that paired with another verse of Scripture at the beginning of Isaiah 27, which also provides additional description and appearance about the appearance and movements of this creature. And then also in Psalms 104, verse 26, this also references Leviathan directly by name as a sea creature created by God. So these references taken together, they provide us with background on why the name Leviathan was chosen for this creature. Again, the name means wreathed or twisted into folds. So these passages describe a terrifying, powerful, greatly feared creature of the sea. And just quickly, here's some characteristics that we learn about this creature. First, from Job 41, we learn that he has a powerful neck, powerful tongue and jaws. We learn that he has terrifying, fearsome teeth, armor-like overlapping scales, fire and flames and smoke pouring out of his mouth. That this creature leaves a shiny white wake trailing behind him in the sea, and that he has no equal on earth. This chapter calls him the king of all creatures and mentions that he has no fear of any other creatures. And then in Isaiah 27, which is used metaphorically in a prophetic sense, but it describes Leviathan as being a quick, swift-moving creature that lives in the sea. It describes him as having twisting and winding movements. And then it uses a couple, in addition to directly referring to this creature as Leviathan, it uses a couple of other nouns to describe him. One is the Hebrew word Nakshah, which appears 30 other times in the Old Testament, which just literally means a serpent. And then also described in that same section of the beginning of Isaiah 27 by another noun of Tanin, which appears about 23 other times in Scripture. It's often translated as monster in most contemporary English translations, although the King James translates it as a dragon, which is probably a maybe not the best translation, certainly not a literal one. So the explanation then of this creature Leviathan, and also we'll throw the behemoth in that's in chapter 40 of Job. So some have concluded that these creatures, Leviathan and also behemoth, there are descriptions of animals that are now known by different names. And some of the conjecture has been that the Leviathan describes a crocodile or perhaps a whale, and the behemoth describes a hippopotamus. So that's one explanation that some folks give for this creature. Another explanation by some is that they are dismissed as merely mythical or legendary creatures, and they point out that they're similar to creatures that exist in myths and legends of other cultures as well. So that is one explanation some give. A third explanation would be that these were real animals at one time that the Bible is describing, but they have since ancient time become extinct, and so we no longer have those animals in modern times. And so those are three different kind of explanations on what Scripture is referring to by the Leviathan creature and also the behemoth. Personally, I probably lean towards the extinct creature view, understanding that some of the description in the Bible may be hyperbole or exaggeration, which is quite common in some of the poetic language of the Bible, but nonetheless, whether there's some hyperbole or not, it was at least based on an actual animal that existed at the time and not just simply a legend or a myth. That seems to be, to me, the most probable explanation. So first, as I mentioned, the Leviathan was an actual creature animal described in the Bible. Now, second, as I mentioned, even though Scripture clearly identifies Leviathan as an actual physical animal, it is also used in the Bible to describe this creature as an analogy for the enemies of Egypt. And at least two different places we can identify this. First, in Psalm 74, verses 13 and 14, this references Leviathan by name, and it seems to be referring to Egypt, specifically Pharaoh and his armies are being referred to here metaphorically as the Leviathan. And the reason that it seems to be the case that this is being used as a metaphor for Egypt is because it is immediately preceded by a description of the Exodus, the working of salvation in ancient times. It's described here in Psalm 74. It also describes dividing the sea with your strength, which is an obvious allusion to the parting of the Red Sea during the Exodus. And then also immediately preceded, it references Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is clearly symbolized by this great sea monster in Ezekiel 29:3 and again in 32:3. It's quite clear that Pharaoh is being referenced as the Leviathan. So Pharaoh, by extension Egypt, is metaphorically described by this Leviathan creature. Now, again, I believe it was probably a real creature on the planet, but has since become extinct. But nevertheless, the Bible uses it to reference Egypt, and also seems in Isaiah 27 to use it as a metaphorical reference to the kingdom of Babylon. And this is Isaiah 27. I'll just read the first verse here. It says, this is reading from the Christian Standard Bible. On that day, the Lord with his relentless, large, strong sword will bring judgment on Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will slay the monster that is in the sea. Now, in context of what Isaiah is talking about at this point in this book, he is talking about the redemption of Israel, the deliverance of Israel, specifically from the captive, which would be Babylon. So this serpent, this monster, this Leviathan, is being used as a metaphor for Babylon, or some believe perhaps for three different kingdoms: Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt together. But so it could be either just Babylon alone, or the three major powers in the world of that time: Assyria and Babylon and Egypt, which all had their hand in manipulating Israel at the time. And those who believe in the threefold references of the three kingdoms of Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt believe that the first reference, Leviathan, the swiftly fleeing serpent, describes Assyria. Leviathan, the twisting, winding serpent, describes Babylon. And the Tannin, or the serpent, described in the third part of that verse, in the sea, would be Egypt. So whether you believe it's a reference to Babylon alone or Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt, these passages are all prophetic in nature, and they're describing a kingdom or kingdoms at the time from whom Israel was being delivered. But then thirdly, Isaiah 27 that we just read is most likely a dual prophecy. In other words, it's a double reference to either Babylon, as we mentioned, or these three ancient kingdoms, and also most likely to the ruler or kingdom to be destroyed at the end time. In both cases, the description of the monstrous serpent also refers symbolically or metaphorically to the evil spirit behind these rulers or kingdoms, which is the devil or Satan himself. And so, like I said, it's a double reference. It's talking about the ancient kingdom, but it's also clearly referencing or prophesying about a ruler and kingdom to be destroyed at the end time, at the end of the age, at the end of the world, during in the book of Revelation. We'll look at some of those in just a moment here. And so, the reason why we think that it's not just referring to the kingdoms and the kings of those kingdoms alone, but to the devil also, who is thought to be influencing those kingdoms and working through those kingdoms. Daniel 10 makes it clear that spiritual forces, good and evil, angels and devils, if you will, are the real influence behind these kings and kingdoms. And if you listen to episode 4 of this podcast that talked about Lucifer, we go into more detail about that. So this truth is also reflected that this symbolism of the serpent or the Leviathan being a metaphor for the devil. This is also reflected in the New Testament. For example, in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, where the Bible reads, "Put on the whole armor of God that ye may be able to stand the wiles of the devil, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So we understand in biblical understanding and biblical explanation that the forces of evil, the principalities, the powers, the rulers of this world are really influenced and to an extent controlled by evil spirits, or by spirits good and evil, if you will. And also we read a possible allusion to this monster, this dragon, the serpent, in Revelation 20, which describes the final defeat of Satan. And reading again from the CSB version, verses 1 and 2 of Revelation 20, "I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And then in verse 10 of the same chapter, "The devil who deceived them was thrown into a lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever." So this is talking about the overthrow, the final defeat of Satan or the devil, and it describes him here as this dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil and Satan. And so it seems that this allusion to the Old Testament prophecies of the monster or the serpent is referring to Satan. So in that way, it seems to be an unmistakable reference to the prophecy of Isaiah 27, certainly fulfilled by the destruction of Babylon, but comes to full or final fruition with the defeat of Satan and his proxies, the beast and the false prophet in Revelation 20. So then Leviathan is used as an image or symbol for Satan in these verses and in these instances, these descriptions, if you will. But also we find this to be the case in many different extra-biblical literary references throughout history. And although those don't have the force and the weight of Scripture, I believe that they were inspired by this, what seems to be a clear metaphor in Scripture, and they continue that metaphor. Many different theories, for example, in demonology, like the study of evil spirits and demons, reference Leviathan. And of course, a lot of that is conjecture and speculation, certainly unsubstantiated, not anywhere near the same level as the Bible in terms of its infallibility and inspiration. But nonetheless, those metaphors carry over into that literature, if you will. Some have even linked, in some literature throughout history, including ancient times, have linked the description or the analogy of Satan as Leviathan to the serpent in Genesis himself. And so there's that correlation, if you will. So to address the rest of Sarah's question here, are Leviathan and Lucifer one and the same? or is Leviathan a separate being from Lucifer, and therefore do we have two evil adversaries? Well, again, in episode 4, I explained in quite some detail the reference to Lucifer in Isaiah 14 and the parallel on Ezekiel 28. So I won't go over that again, but in short, those passages describe human kings of Babylon and Tyre, respectively, and also spiritual influence or control of the devil or Satan who animated these human kings, if you will. So those passages appear to digress from the immediate topic of prophecies against Babylon and Tyre and delve into the origin or the background of the devil or Satan himself. So Isaiah 14 specifically addresses Halel, which is literally light bringer or light bearer or morning star, which came to be translated as Lucifer in the Latin Vulgate and then later in some English translations, including the King James and others. Now, that's a questionable and a controversial translation based on other ancient references, not a literal translation of Halel, but nevertheless, the devil became known as Satan because of that historical reference, if you will. So at any rate, my answer then to Sarah's question, the figure known as Lucifer from Isaiah 14, whether correctly translated or not, is in fact referring to the devil or Satan. Leviathan then is the actual Hebrew term for an animal or creature, as we said, a sea monster or sea serpent, either renamed mythical or extinct, but referring to an animal nonetheless in any regard, but also a metaphor for or symbol for the devil or Satan. So in Scripture, Leviathan is technically not another name for Satan, if you will. It's just an animal, but that animal is used as a metaphor for Satan, and therefore for some, and especially in extra-biblical literature, has become somewhat of an alias for the devil. So in one way or another, both Lucifer and Leviathan are, in this metaphorical sense, are referencing the same thing, Satan. That is what the biblical references to both seem to clearly demonstrate. And furthermore, I'm personally not aware of any tradition or literary reference that describes Leviathan as a different being, a different spirit or a different devil that's different somehow from Lucifer or Satan. If such a theory exists, then it's certainly not widely held or widely respected. Someone might have speculated that, but I don't believe that's the case. So both the term Lucifer and the term Leviathan, they're both used in conjunction with the devil or Satan, but it would be the same being, if you will, not two different ones, not two different adversaries, from the best that I can tell. It wouldn't surprise me, certainly, if some demonologists would to assert something like there was two different, devils or something like that, because they come up with all kind of kooky ideas that are not found in Scripture. But if we're just looking at the general sense of Scripture, and the metaphoric sense in which both Lucifer and Leviathan are used, they both refer symbolically, metaphorically, prophetically to the devil or Satan himself. So Sarah, thank you for the question. I hope that does an adequate job of answering your inquiry. And quickly, I want to move to try to get in a second question here. Don't have much time left, so I picked one that can be answered fairly briefly. Now, this is an example of a question. Many of the questions I've gotten sent to me are, on kind of controversial topics or are topics that require, some degree of speculation to some regard or another. Certainly topics that aren't directly addressed, which is what makes them debatable and interesting. But I also like questions that are just, more about the meaning and understanding of certain passages or verses of Scripture. So I would encourage you, I'd love to answer both, but I encourage people to send more questions of this nature as well. And so this was submitted by a Facebook user. I apologize, I forgot to include the name here, someone I didn't know, but a listener. So thank you for sending your question. But the question was, why does the Bible call Lot Abraham's brother when we know Lot was his nephew? And then the reference they provided was Genesis 14 and 16. So first, let's read the text here. We'll read Genesis 14:11 through 16. It says this: "And they took the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, all their victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were the confederate with Abram." And then verse 14, "And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, borne his own house, 318, and pursued unto Dan." And then skipping down to verse 16, it says, "And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods," etc., etc. So we see here in this passage of Scripture, it actually refers to Lot 3 different times. The first time in verse 12, where it calls him Lot, Abram's brother's son. And then in verse 14, it says, "And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive," and again, we assume this means Lot. And then in verse 16, it becomes clear. He said, "And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot." So the question here is, why does it refer, if he's his brother's son, which we understand to be his nephew, then why does it call him his brother? So obviously Genesis does establish that Lot is the son of Abram's brother. We just read it there in Genesis 14. It's also in Genesis 11:27, Genesis 12:5. It's a clear connection that this is Lot is Abram's brother's son, so his nephew in our contemporary terminology. So the reason that this is a bit confusing is that the Hebrew term here in Genesis 14 and 16 and elsewhere also, the Hebrew term here is ak, I believe it's pronounced. And this term has a broader meaning than the English translation brother that's captured here in the King James Version. Other English translations use the same, other English translations use the term relative or kinsman, or some will even just use the term nephew in this and other applicable verses. Now, of course, nephew would be assumed from the context and not a literal translation, but it would make sense in the context. So the term brother that we see here in the King James, it's not an incorrect translation per se, if one understands that it can have a wider meaning that is restricted to the sense of male siblings alone. You know, we think of a brother primarily as a male sibling, but we also, even in contemporary terminology, we call our friends brothers, close relations are brothers, brothers in arms, that sort of thing. So as other English translations correctly translate it, relative or kinsman would be most literal. Brother is more of a wider sense, but not an incorrect translation. We just have to understand it has a wider meaning than a male sibling. So interestingly, Hebrew, in the biblical Hebrew, didn't actually have a term specifically for nephew. That's why it doesn't say nephew, it says his brother's son. And there's only 2 times in the King James Version that the word nephew appears in English, obviously. And that's translated from another Hebrew word, neked, which literally or technically means to propagate offspring, progeny, or posterity. And so, again, the meaning nephew is assumed or derived from the context, not a literal translation, but because of the context being the son of one's brother, we call that nephew, but it would probably be literally best translated relative or kinsman, or just to name the relationship, the son of the brother, or the son of the brother. And so that's the explanation that I have for the reason why Lot is referred both as Abraham's nephew, or the son of his brother, and Abraham's brother in the sense of relative or kinsman, a wider meaning of the term brother than just a strict biological sibling. And interestingly, the ancient Hebrew had a very limited vocabulary. There's only about 8,200 words in the ancient Hebrew biblical vocabulary, based on about 2,100 root words. About 2,000 of those 8,200 words only appear once in the text. So that's a very limited vocabulary compared to the 181,000 words in contemporary English. That's not a lot of words to choose from. So we can understand sometimes why there's, I wouldn't say difficulties, but there's some challenges to translating this language that has a limited vocabulary into a language like English that has a much more expanded vocabulary. Now, of course, the Hebrew language developed over time and later developed many more words, but the Old Testament itself only has a vocabulary of about 8,200 words. Well, I hope that answers the question, and that is a great question. Again, I'd love to have more questions about specific translations or interpretations of verses, but I'm happy to answer any questions that are submitted to me. So that's going to wrap it up for today. Once again, thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bible FAQ with Kirk Van. And so until next time, the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. Thank you again for listening. Goodbye for now.